Breeze in the north and the west, it stays frost-free, but for, say, the southeastern third of the country, temperatures dipping close to freezing, or in some rural spots down to -1 or -2 Celsius. So a touch of frost to begin things for parts of England, parts of East Wales, first thing tomorrow. Plenty of sunshine, though. We'll keep the sunny skies for much of England, Wales, bright skies as well for southern and eastern Scotland. But the further northwest you are, the thicker the cloud will be, and that cloud giving a few spots of rain for mainly the higher parts of western Scotland and Northern Ireland. It'll also be breezy towards the northwest, risk of gales at times for the Western Isles, but that breeze coming up from the south, so relatively mild temperatures in the double figures in most places. Then through Saturday night, a band of rain approaches from the northwest. That will push through during Sunday, weaken, and so for many places, Sunday is another fine day.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome to the briefing with me, Isabel Oakeshott. Coming up on today's show, we'll talk about the escalating crisis in Ukraine as Russian troops are approaching the capital city of Kiev. All this and more, but first, here's your latest news.
Good afternoon, it's 12 o'clock. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. NATO and the UK must not deploy troops to Ukraine as Russia's invasion advances on the capital. That's the message from Armed Forces Minister James Heappey. New images show the Ukrainian National Guard on the streets of the city this morning, Kiev, as gunfire was heard near the government quarter. Overnight, residents sheltered underground during missile strikes. The UN has warned up to 5 million people could be forced to flee abroad. Speaking in the Commons earlier, here's what Mr. Heappey had to say.
We will explore all that we can do to support the Ukrainians themselves over the next few days. But we must all in this House be clear that British and NATO troops should not, must not play an active role in Ukraine. We must all be clear what the risks of miscalculation could be and how existential that could very quickly become if people miscalculate and things escalate unnecessarily.
And speaking to GB News this morning, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said despite their advances today, the Russian army failed to achieve their key military goals on day one.
There is some ray of light and hope for the Ukrainians.
Russia failed to get its objectives in the first 24 hours. It had planned a number of cities. It had failed to do that. It lost over 450 personnel of the army. It lost fighter jets and aircraft and helicopters and armoured vehicles. And the world has seen Putin for what he is, and that will, give him a legacy he doesn't want.
Ben was speaking to us earlier. Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky said current sanctions on Russia aren't enough and demanded effective counteraction from its international partners.
This morning, we are alone in defending our country, just like yesterday. The most powerful forces in the world watch from afar. Have yesterday's sanctions persuaded Russia? We see in our skies and feel on the ground that they are not enough.
That as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has spoken out about the possibility of Russia invading beyond Ukraine.
Is it a possibility that Putin goes beyond Ukraine? Sure, it's a possibility, but there's something very powerful standing in the way of that. That's something we call Article 5 of NATO. That means an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all members of NATO. The President's been very clear that we will defend every inch of NATO territory. I think that's the most powerful deterrent against President Putin going beyond Ukraine.
Now, UEFA has confirmed that this season's Champions League final will no longer take place in St. Petersburg. Instead, it's been moved to Paris. The Kremlin said it regrets the decision by European football's governing body, claiming St. Petersburg would have made a good host. The showpiece event was set to be played at the Gazprom Arena in the Russian city on May the 28th. Rape victims are being continually and systematically failed by the criminal justice system. That's according to a prosecution watchdog. A lack of cooperation between police and prosecutors and poor communication with victims is being blamed for cases taking an average of 2 years to come to trial. 3 former Minneapolis police officers have been convicted of violating 46-year-old George Floyd's civil rights in June 2020. The trio were all charged with failing to provide medical aid when Derek Chauvin held his knee to Mr. Floyd's neck for 9.5 minutes. The 46-year-old's murder by the police officer sparked racial injustice protests around the world. The UK's COVID-19 vaccine rollout has been praised by a public spending watchdog. That's despite millions of doses being wasted. A report from the National Audit Office said delivering jabs early helped save lives and reduce serious illness and hospitalisation. Despite confirming 4.7 million vaccines were wasted, the report says the number was much lower than initially expected. It concluded that the operation had been a good use of public money. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now it's back to the briefing with Isabel Oakeshott.
Hello and welcome to the briefing with me, Isabel Oakeshott. Russia intensifies its assault on Ukraine with fears the capital, Kiev, could fall within days. We speak with the chairman of the Defence Select Committee. We'll hear from Russian security expert Mark Galeotti and a leading advisor in global strategy. And UK airlines have been banned from Russian airspace. We get reaction to this from a travel expert. All that coming up, but first, the Oakeshott opinion. Now, as defence experts predict that the capital of Ukraine could fall within days, it's easy to despair that we haven't done more. It's easy to pour scorn on the sanctions the UK government has announced, to say that they're nowhere near enough, and just to ridicule Foreign Secretary Liz Truss for the fur hat she wore when she visited Moscow earlier this month to try to talk some sense into President Putin. It's easy to wring our hands and say we've been useless. It's easy to lament Western weakness and bemoan our collective lack of strategic foresight. It's easy to adopt a fatalistic attitude to what's happened, shrugging that Britain is no longer a big player on the world stage. Well, some of that is right. The West has been complacent, allowing the Russian president to pursue his malign territorial ambitions, and the UK government shouldn't have allowed so much Russian money to wash through London or legitimise Putin's oligarchs. But during this crisis, the UK has shown that it is still a significant player on the world stage, and I think that's partly down to Brexit. The truth is, that we have led the global response to this crisis, tirelessly pursuing diplomatic solutions, even when it was hopeless, and then announcing sanctions against Russia before the EU or the US. Indeed, we've been actively supporting Ukraine since way back in 2014, following the annexation of Crimea. So we did see this coming, and we did try to do something about it. Members of the British Armed Forces have been stationed in Ukraine for years, helping train the Ukrainian military to defend their country. We have engaged in multiple joint training operations. We have put boots on the ground, ships in the sea, and parachutes in the air. Now, against a Russian army several times the size of our own and theirs, of course it's not enough. But we have been there, which is more than can be said for most of our allies. This isn't just about training. We've been sending non-lethal equipment to Ukraine for years, £2.2 million worth. The UK was one of the first countries to send lethal equipment. The UK has led the way, arguing for Russia to be kicked out of the international bank transfer system, SWIFT. What does the EU do? Well, pretty much nothing. To date, EU support, if we could call it that, has been limited to what they call civilian security, in other words, peacekeeping. The truth is that the EU has not wanted to rattle Putin's cage because Germany gets at least 30% of its gas from Russia. Italy is also desperately exposed. Just look what happened yesterday. The EU kiboshed attempts to kick Russia out of the SWIFT system. German Chancellor Scholz confirmed that he is against this move. Frankly, it's a miracle he pressed pause on Russia's new gas pipeline to Germany, Nordstream 2. It's no accident, I think, that the UK has been very confident in leading the way in this crisis. That is a benefit of Brexit. We are punching above our weight. If we were still in the EU, I think there would have been a much more pressurised situation for a united voice. And guess what? We would have had to have gone at the pace of the slowest member, i.e. Germany. So let's not talk ourselves down too much, because we are just beginning to show what we can do now we've left the EU. Now, joining me to discuss the latest developments in Ukraine is our Home and Security Editor, Mark White. Good morning, Mark. What is the latest situation? We've heard Ben Wallace this morning and other ministers out and about talking down the prospect of any escalation involving UK boots on the ground. Where are we at?
Hi there, Isabel. Yes, you're absolutely right in terms of, interestingly, your monologue there when you were mentioning the aid that Britain has already given to Ukraine, especially in terms of lethal aid. It stepped up those operations in recent weeks when other countries were not. It had 100 British troops in Ukraine training thousands of Ukrainian members of the military in how to use these Javelin shoulder-launched anti-tank missiles, which apparently, according to the Ukraine military, they have been using to good effect. The Ukraine military, that is, claim that they have shot down at least 2 Russian helicopters using those same shoulder-launched missiles. Now, very interestingly, James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, in the Commons this afternoon was talking about the need to send more in the way of lethal aid. Now, what he wouldn't do, Isabel, is give any detail on that, understandably, because of the very sensitive nature of trying to get more of these shoulder-launched missile systems and other potential lethal aid into Ukraine. But he said that would be part of a package of measures of both non-lethal and lethal aid that Britain would be directly engaged in to try to help out the Ukrainians. We're looking at the pictures there of some of the wreckage from both missile strikes. We believe that is the wreckage of an aircraft that was shot down over the Ukrainian capital this morning. You can see also from that some of the damage to buildings. There's an apartment block in the Ukrainian capital which was badly damaged, according to various sources. You can see those pictures again. That's come to us from the Reuters news agency. interestingly, I don't know if we still have this, Isabel, but there is a still image that shows Ukrainian defense forces on a bridge. There you see it in central Kiev, on the ground, taking up the defensive positions. It is on the ground at the moment, understandably extremely tense and fast-moving, with reports of Russian military personnel up to the northern outskirts of Kiev and trying to push south. There was gunfire heard in Ukraine a few hours ago, in Kiev, I should say, but we believe that was in the form of warning shots. There was some real concern that perhaps the fighting had moved into the city centre itself. And the other thing to add, I think, that's important to get across to our viewers is the fact that Britain is bolstering the number of troops that it's sending to Baltic countries in that region, understandably very nervous. So Estonia, for instance, you're looking now at hundreds of military personnel, their tanks, heavy weaponry, 1,000 extra British troops going into Estonia to effectively double the number of British military personnel on the ground in that NATO ally. Again, we've sent more in the way of troops to Poland, and as well as reassuring those NATO allies in case that conflict in Ukraine spills over its borders, they are likely to be involved in the growing humanitarian crisis. We have already seen this morning, Isabel, that in Romania, some 28,000 refugees have spilled across the border into that country, and also in, I think in Poland, it was 28,000, sorry, and in Romania, some 11,000. Fluid situation on the ground, but according to the Ukrainians themselves, 100,000 people have fled some of the direct fighting and are heading towards the borders as we speak.
Thank you for that, Mark. And I think we're just hearing that the Grand Prix fixture that was planned to take place in Russia has been cancelled. We've also had the UEFA decision. So bit by bit, Russia is being isolated from the international community. Is there more to come on that front?
Well, yeah, so as you say, I mean, sporting events have been, in terms of both the UEFA Champions League final and that announcement just come out now about the Russian Grand Prix, are being taken away from Russia, not to allow Vladimir Putin to have the prestige of these big sporting occasions on his soil. And in addition to that, we have the biggest package of sanctions ever, really, against another nation, according to those ministers here in the UK and elsewhere across Europe and the US. 100 companies and individuals at the moment being targeted by the UK, and those sanctions may get tougher still. It is a tiered process, depending, of course, on Vladimir Putin's next move.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for that. And we're now going to go over to the chair of the Westminster Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. I am a little bit concerned that we sound like a government press release at this point. We've been very supportive of what the government has done. I'm sure you, Tobias, will have a slightly different perspective, because your view, I think, is that we've not shown quite enough resolve at this point. Is that right?
No, we haven't, and I think history will show that perhaps 6 months ago we could have done more. We've decided not to take advantage of the one asset which Putin actually is scared of, and that's NATO. It's this formidable, potent military capability, the largest alliance in the world, and we have decided not to utilize that. I did call for a division to be moved into the country to act as a deterrent, to dissuade Putin to invade, and I'm sure that would have happened. That decision was taken. It's for the history books to mull that over. We have to deal with now. I'm pleased to see that there is huge solidarity and support for the Prime Minister for the additional sanctions yesterday, because the first tranche was not going to have any effect whatsoever. And we do need to get ahead of the decision making here. We've been playing catch up with Putin all along. We tried diplomacy, that wasn't going to work. There was no carrot, no stick. We then tried sanctions as well, and that hasn't dissuaded Putin from advancing his interests. We do need to look at other ways that we can provide support for the Ukrainians. And that, I'm afraid, does take us back to NATO. There are ways that we can provide military support in their hour of need, and I hope these are the sort of things that are now being discussed.
Of course, and it's a rather big one, that if we start getting NATO actively involved in the way that you suggest, we are going to be on course for a potential World War III. It seems to me that nobody in the international community is taking that call that you've just made seriously to get NATO involved.
Well, getting NATO involved has a full spectrum of interest there, going from boots on the ground, which, as I say, that moment has come and gone 6 months ago. It would now be, I think, inflammatory to do that. You can certainly introduce a no-fly zone from up to the Dnieper River in the west. From a humanitarian perspective, you can put that in. That would be bold, and yes, it would include risk. The bigger question you have to ask yourself is, if you don't stand up to a dictator, if you don't stand up to a tyrant, particularly as we're seeing one that has the support of another authoritarian regime in the form of China, where does this then go? And that is the bigger questions we need to recognize. This isn't just about Ukraine. We parked off what was happening in Eastern Europe as, particularly perhaps bruised after Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's not go there. We don't want to get involved with that. We're now recognizing food prices will go up in the UK now. Oil and gas prices will go up in the UK. Not only that, the retaliatory sanctions will have an impact on businesses here in the UK as well. We have to stand firm and remind ourselves what we believe in, what we stand for, what we are willing to defend. We've had 3 decades of pretty much, a peaceful era. But that is not the norm. Prior to the Cold War, it was the usual to have conflict, to have a threat posed there, for us to have to be on our guard, to have to work and defend democracy. And I think we're entering a new era where we need to reinvigorate ourselves. We need to spend more money. We certainly need to increase defense spending to 3% now.
Well, I thought I was in a parallel universe yesterday when I heard the Liberal Democrat leader, Ed Davey, calling for exactly that, for a reverse of defence cuts. These are defence cuts the Lib Dems presided over during the coalition years, I'm sure you'll remember. On the issue of the no-fly zone, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace addressed that head-on this morning in interviews. He basically said that is not on the cards. That would involve us putting fighter jets up against the Russians, and that would be most likely to inflame things yet further. But many people will be wondering, if we don't do that, is there a real prospect that President Putin will take this further and actually dare step into any of the Baltic states as NATO members? Do you think that's realistic?
I do. I think we need to be careful of where Putin is going. He has a plan. We are dismissing him as maybe somehow unhinged or crazy. All sorts of words are being used, but he's actually followed his plan to the book. We've seen troops amassing, we've seen false flags, disinformation campaigns, the idea to provoke. He's got the Duma, his parliament, to dutifully nod through the legislation that he needs. And then we saw him advance into the Luhansk and Donetsk areas, and then a full invasion. And I'm sure he has further intentions, not necessarily in NATO countries, but certainly perhaps in the Balkans, maybe in the Arctic as well, or perhaps even in the Middle East too, where he has interests. And indeed, he's sending troops, filling vacuums in North Africa, in Mali as well. So we need to be aware of where the world is moving, and it's moving very, very quickly. And we have become, I'm afraid, rather timid, rather risk averse. And as you imply, when do you stop? When do you start standing up to a bully? Because if you do stop and hesitate, they simply ask and demand for more. We saw that in the last century, and I'm pleased that we're starting to regroup. We're starting to appreciate this is not just about Ukraine. This is a wider impact on European and global security. But we need to move much, much faster rather than reacting to events, but be able to get ahead of them.
Thank you. Now, there are clear divisions across the EU in terms of the importance of cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system. I think our government has been fairly clear that they believe that is something that should be done. Why are our EU allies resisting on this, and what would you say to them?
Well, let's just take sanctions again as another tool. It's only one of the tools that you've used, and it needs to be used carefully. I've absolutely been in favour of targeted sanctions, and particularly those oligarchs that have their money here in the UK. And we're finally catching up with that. But sanctions are always a double-edged tool, because what's going to happen is that there'll be retaliatory actions from the state that you attack. There'll also be British businesses that have interests in Russia as well. 20% of Rolls-Royce's titanium that they use for when they make engines comes from Russia. It's a rare metal. Where are we going to get that? That will impact on a big business here in the UK. So we need to work out how these are going to be most effective. On the SWIFT system, again, you've got Italy and Germany that require oil and gas to provide their energy. How is that paid for? Through the international financial mechanisms of the SWIFT system. So if you close that down, they won't be able to pay for their energy, and therefore they will have an economic problems keeping their country going. This is all a wider picture, which points to the fact that we've been asleep at the wheel over the last 10 years, that we don't have a Russia strategy. We don't have a way to wean ourselves off our reliance on what Russia provides. And as long as that is the case, it's going to be very difficult to change Russia's behavior.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Tobias Ellwood, the chairman of the Defence Select Committee at Westminster. Now, coming up, what is Putin's endgame? What does he want to achieve with the invasion of Ukraine? We're going to be speaking to an expert on Russian foreign affairs, but before that, a short break.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the programme. Now we're continuing our coverage of the invasion of Ukraine throughout the hour. Let's turn our attention to what Russian President Vladimir Putin is actually hoping to achieve with the invasion of Ukraine. Joining us to discuss this is Mark Galeotti, an expert in Russian security affairs and also in the personality and character of President Putin, and he's a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you for joining us, Mark. You wrote a very powerful piece in today's Daily Mail in which you described President Putin as an old man in a hurry, obsessed with history. It's easy to forget, isn't it, that he's 69. There's a lot of Botox going on there. How far is he going to go in this quest for a legacy?
Well, that's the real question, and the only honest answer I can give is clearly I don't know. But I think what is clear is exactly just how important this is to him. I mean, watching the speeches he gave, firstly when he was announcing on Monday evening the recognition of these kind of rebel fake states, and then his declaration of war, is that this is not the cool, calm, and collected geopolitical strategist at work. This was really visceral and emotional. And for him, Ukraine is a central, frankly, part of kind of Russia's patrimony. So, I mean, I think he's, although not in totally self-destructive ways, I think he's willing to push this as far as he thinks he can go. Remember, this is a man who does indeed think that we in the West are ultimately strong but weak, in the sense of we have all kinds of powers, but we don't have the will to use them. So he feels that this is his opportunity to basically create a fait accompli and not have to worry too much about what the West will make of it.
I think, though, you do say in your article, and I think you've expressed before, that you wouldn't suggest that he would go so far as to actually start going into Baltic states or upsetting any member of NATO, either in the short term or in the medium term.
No, I mean, first of all, it's clear that the Russians do understand that NATO is this extraordinarily powerful engine of military solidarity, that an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all. And, you know, we mustn't forget that put together, NATO has twice as many soldiers as Russia. Admittedly, they're not all in the right place. They're still too heavily geared for intervention wars in places like Afghanistan. But still, that's not a force to be ignored. But more to the point, he doesn't really care so much. He has no interest, really, in the NATO areas, even the Baltic states. Ukraine is different. And again, if he's thinking about his legacy, a Russia that has totally lost Ukraine, I mean, that would be a terrible, as he would see it, stain on his historical record. This is a man we do know is obsessed with this idea of how will future generations be assessing him. And he could not, in his mind, go down as the Tsar who lost Ukraine. But let's be honest, that's something that's special about Ukraine. It has this very, very powerful place in Russia's culture and Russia's historical evolution.
Very powerfully how isolated he's become in recent years. And I don't mean kind of politically isolated, but almost literally physically isolated. I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate on that, some of the colour that you've written about that and how cut off he's been during the pandemic, and also why that's significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting again to wonder how far, amongst all the many terrible legacies of COVID, how far actually the Ukraine war is one of them. Look, even before COVID, Putin was becoming increasingly isolated in terms of fewer and fewer people in his circle in general, but also especially he was easing out those people who had slightly different perspectives. Increasingly, he was just surrounded by yes men and people who essentially had the same background and opinions as him. He didn't travel so much. He didn't see the country. And then COVID hit. And there was this extraordinary biosecurity bubble that was put around him. I mean, for example, most people, if they were going to ever meet Putin, they had to spend 2 weeks in a government hotel under armed guard, it's worth mentioning. This was a very serious quarantine. And even then, they had to walk through this kind of bizarre corridor which was fogged with disinfectant and bathed with germ-killing ultraviolet light, before they could ever reach the man that Putin's own entourage calls the body. Wow. And what that meant is that basically very, very few people who weren't in his innermost circle got to meet him. Life became viewed through, two-dimensional screens, and to an extent like the rest of us, but particularly I think it's his country. Very much, I think there's a sense that Putin is now isolated from Russia and from Russians. He has no real idea of what they think, how they live, or anything like that. He experiences his life purely through the manila folders that are put on his desk. I mean, he doesn't even have a smartphone. He doesn't go on the internet, so he hasn't even got that access point. So again, this is one of the reasons why I think Putin is not insane, I mean, he has some pretty insane ideas, but that's a different matter. But the point is, the most rational leader can make some deeply stupid and dangerous decisions if it's based on an inadequate and partial amount of information.
Absolutely fascinating, all that detail on his personality and how he's been living. Very briefly, because we're nearly out of time, and Ukraine is an enormous country, and evidently many there are willing to fight to the death. Do you think there'll be pockets of resistance for a very long time? It's not going to be very easy to take the whole country, is it?
Absolutely. This is Putin's big miscalculation. It's relatively a straightforward matter of defeating the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. But you defeating the Ukrainian people, that I think is something that he will fail at. And that's why this is ultimately, I think, the beginning of the end of Putinism.
Thank you very much, Mark Galliotti there. Now, coming up, what does the invasion of Ukraine mean for our food and energy prices? Very worrying times on that. But first, let's get a news update.
It's 12:32. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. NATO and the UK must not deploy troops to Ukraine as Russia's invasion advances on the capital. That's the message from Armed Forces Minister James Heappey. New images show the Ukrainian National Guard on the streets of Kiev this morning as gunfire was heard near the government quarter. Overnight, residents sheltered underground during missile strikes. The UN has warned up to 5 million people could be forced to flee the country. Speaking in the Commons earlier, Mr Heappey warned NATO against military escalation.
We will explore all that we can do to support the Ukrainians themselves over the next few days, but we must all in this House be clear that British and NATO troops should not, must not play an active role in Ukraine. We must all be clear what the risks of miscalculation could be and how existential that could very quickly become if people miscalculate and things escalate unnecessarily.
The Russian Grand Prix has been cancelled. Formula One confirmed in the last half hour, the latest sport to react to the invasion of Ukraine. It was due to be held in Sochi on September the 25th. It follows UEFA's confirmation this morning that this season's Champions League final on May the 28th will no longer take place in St. Petersburg. Instead, it's been moved to Paris. The Kremlin has said it regrets the decision by European football's governing body. Here in the UK, rape victims are being continually and systematically failed by the criminal justice system. That's according to a joint report by the Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate. A lack of cooperation between police and prosecutors and poor communication with victims is being blamed for cases taking an average of 2 years to come to trial. The UK's COVID-19 vaccine rollout has been praised by a public spending watchdog, despite millions of doses being wasted. A report from the National Audit Office said delivering jabs early helped save lives and reduce serious illness and hospitalisation. TV online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. More at the top of the hour. It's back to the briefing with Isabel Oakeshott in just a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, from pandemics, adverse weather events, global economic disparities to armed conflicts, the world's always in a state of flux. As we saw during the pandemic, entire global supply chains can grind to a halt, and we're now witnessing the long-term economic effects of that. I'm joined now by Dr. Parag Khanna, the founder and managing partner of Future Map. Dr. Khanna has written multiple best-selling books, including The Future is Asian, Connectography, and his latest book, Move, which looks into the future of migration of the human race. And Dr. Khanna advises governments all around the world on the latest geopolitical developments. He joins me now. Thank you very much for joining us on what I'm sure is an incredibly busy day for you. I think a lot of people here in the UK will be fascinated by what you have to say about what's going to happen in terms of supply chains and commodities. For example, Ukraine is one of the biggest exporters of corn. What will the consequences of that be for the food supply chain around the world, do you think?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to join you, and thank you for having me on. And indeed, this, as you rightly referenced, adds on to the pandemic as one of the disruptions, whether it's unforeseen or otherwise, to global supply chains for critical goods, commodities, and in the case of your question, agriculture right now. And Russia and Ukraine both have been growing food producers and food exporters. In fact, Russia in 2021 was the world's largest exporter of wheat, for example. China imports a lot of barley, for example, from Ukraine. We've just received word that a number of the Trans-Siberian railways that are operating the freight corridors and shipping various agricultural goods and commodities across Eurasia, effectively from Europe all the way to China, are going to have their operations suspended. So that's going to impact, of course, on Ukrainian food exports all the way to the east. So, for those specific commodities where Ukraine is a central player, obviously there's going to be additional disruption. And the same thing applies for Russian exports as well because of sanctions. So every country, again, whether it's the pandemic disruption that was unforeseen or whether it is this invasion, now has to constantly rethink, recalibrate, remap, resource, procure alternative geographies of from which to import basic goods. And I think this is just part and parcel of the complexity of globalization today, that we have sort of one crisis after another that forces us to rethink how resilient our global supply chain networks are.
And how long do you think it will be before the impact of that is felt in supermarkets here in the UK and elsewhere, I suppose? Are we talking within the next few days, or is the knock-on effect generally a little bit more time lag than that?
Certainly a little bit longer than that. It really depends, of course, on the stockpiles of grain or other, commodities and foodstuffs that countries have. Again, the alternative supply or suppliers that they have contracts with. It depends on prices and forward spot markets. There are a lot of variables here. So, it really depends on which country you're in and your connectivity, if you will, or dependence on Ukraine and Russia at this point in time. And then obviously competition over the new suppliers who wind up being the alternative providers of certain goods. So all of those variables have to be taken into account. And that's precisely what the grocers are doing. That's what the importers and import exporters and of course the various companies that are the commodities traders are doing right now in terms of trying to figure out how they can continue to meet their international obligations.
Indeed. Now, earlier this week, we found out that Germany is going to cancel Nordstream 2, or at least press a very long pause on it. That's the new gas pipeline. What effect do you expect that to have on the energy market? I mean, it wasn't up and running already, so this is going to be a much longer-term implication.
Right, indeed. This Nord Stream 2 pipeline was not operational and now will not be operational. But of course, at the same time, as you know and have certainly reported, European gas imports are accelerating or increasing in order to build up those reserves within Europe. So it's having a perverse impact, at least temporarily. And indeed, Europe is still dependent on Russia for nearly half of its oil and gas imports. Irrespective of Nord Stream 2. So, obviously this is once and for all going to promote, genuine European efforts at supply diversification, increasing LNG imports to the United States, more efforts to tap Arctic resources, North African resources, and of course to invest more in alternative and renewables, whether it's nuclear or solar or wind, all of those things. But again, each of those plays out in different timescales. So in the short term, though, again, in the very short term, you might say, meaning the last 24 hours and the next 48 to 72 hours, you're seeing that Europe simply needs to meet demand. And therefore, it's actually business as usual, which obviously is very disconsonant with the political tone of the moment.
And you have written a whole book on the increasing mobility of populations, and everything that's happening now, I suspect, will serve to underline the arguments you make in that book about the mass migrations that we can expect. What do you think that the Ukraine crisis now means for the movement of people? This will be something that is certainly going to be concerning border countries.
Right. There have been political events, interstate conflicts, civil war, state collapse from Venezuela to Syria to Yemen to Afghanistan that have been major drivers of outward migration, refugees, asylum seekers over obviously centuries, but now in just the examples I mentioned the last few years. And Putin in particular, Russia and have been active players in this notion of weaponizing migration. They were doing so just a couple of months ago at the peak of the winter, taking Arab and Afghan populations and pushing them towards Lithuania and so forth. So this is going to generate yet another refugee crisis. It already is, as we see with Ukrainian populations that are moving westward towards Poland, for example. And unfortunately, this is not something that Putin is all that concerned about. It's something that he obviously wants to see happen. The West can obviously show strong solidarity by easing the passage as much as possible, while also, of course, providing those necessary resources for those people, for the Ukrainians still in Ukraine, which is, of course, most of them. But indeed, this is just yet another significant political migration crisis that the world now faces. But in this case, I would like to believe that it's more temporary than some of the others, where a state has genuinely been destroyed beyond recognition, a place like Syria. It's far harder to imagine the millions of Syrians going back to Syria anytime soon, whereas one hopes one way or the other, even if that is a false hope at this moment in time, that this is not a endlessly protracted conflict, that Ukrainians, by virtue of the society that they are, the strong will that they have, the solidarity that they have, those Ukrainians that have left, are certainly going to want to go back.
And your book, Connectography, argues that we need to look at the world in a rather different way, almost as a series of networks. I'm wondering if there are implications now of this crisis for undersea cables, for example. Could you explain to our viewers about that? Because that's something you write a lot about.
Yes, and let me first be clear that Russia is a major power that is not very well connected or integrated to global trade, to global finance, to these global networks. And states like that tend to have the fairly isolated view that comes with their limited connectivity. And if you layer on top of that authoritarian, megalomaniacal leader like Putin, you do get situations like this. And I've advocated a strategy of, not now, obviously, but over the last 10, 15 years, leaders thinking about ways not to sanction and isolate countries and further drive them away, but rather to build a mutually beneficial connectivity with those countries so that they feel that they are stakeholders in the global system. And in Russia, that has proven not to be the case. We haven't done it. Now, when it comes to with pipelines, however, what is interesting is that, again, Nord Stream 2 notwithstanding, there are ways, given the existing resource flows, to channel Russian energy via its Western destinations back through what are called reverse flows into countries like Poland and Ukraine itself, in instances of Russia attempting to cut these countries off. So building more connectivity, building more infrastructure is actually part of how we build our own resilience, as it were. So again, infrastructure and supply chains play a critical role. But at this point now, Russia is going to be further cut off from the global system. For example, the debate about whether or not its banks will be cut off from SWIFT. They're certainly being sanctioned anyway. And I think it's going to be a long time before that re-engagement with Russia occurs. And that ultimately, even though it's perhaps an inevitable consequence of the present moment, is a very undesirable situation, because you really don't transform societies in the direction that you want them to, or transform them at all, unless you focus on building those bridges.
So you mentioned SWIFT just very briefly, because we're getting tight on time now. Would you then advocate against cutting them off from the SWIFT system?
Well, I think, as some of your previous guests have also commented, it is a two-way street, right? You not only make it difficult for those entities to receive payments, or rather to make payments and to participate in their market transactions, but you make it hard for your own businesses that are involved with, in legitimate business operations, let's say, to actually make payments, and therefore their supply chains are affected, and that would directly impact, for sure. So that goes back to the question about resilience, whether it's agriculture, whether it's metals, or any other imports coming from Russia. If you can no longer pay for them, you should first, determine, and quite frankly, again, this is something that companies and governments should have been planning for, almost knowing that this invasion was coming. Who are their alternative suppliers for those goods that they procure from Russia, and how are they going to pay for them in the event that Russia is cut off from SWIFT? And this is what political risk analysis is all about. And I think we've been caught off guard in more ways than one here.
No easy answers, unfortunately. Well, I hope you will be able to come on again, because I did want to talk to you about the implications here for China, perhaps another time. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Parik Khanna. Now, travel. Earlier this week, the UK dropped the last coronavirus restrictions. A legal requirement to self-isolate after testing positive or being in contact with a positive case has been scrapped, and free coronavirus testing is going to end in April. However, as anyone who's tried to go away after over half term, or is planning an Easter or summer holiday knows, international travel is still very, very complicated, with entry requirements to many countries changing by the day. Only this morning, President Putin banned all British flights to and from Russia, obviously not because of coronavirus, but because of the geopolitical situation. Joining me now is Belinda Hindmarch, who is a Senior Vice President of the business travel expert group CWT. Thank you for joining us this morning, Belinda, or the afternoon now. To what extent is the world opening up now post-coronavirus in terms of travel?
Thanks, Isabel. Great to be here today. So for context, at CWT, we manage every aspect of business travel and meeting and events for large corporations and governments, connecting people literally all over the globe. So needless to say, we have seen firsthand the impact on COVID and all of the travel restrictions over the last 2 years. And quite frankly, it's been a very fluid situation. You mentioned it's constantly changing. We've constantly had to adapt. Our travellers have constantly had to adapt to all of the uncertainty that the travel restrictions have brought to bear. So obviously great news that we're seeing those restrictions lift. It's great news for our industry. It's great news for our customers. And certainly it will be able to help address a lot of the pent-up demand that we're seeing.
There are still a number of countries that remain pretty inaccessible, isn't that right? I mean, where are we now with Australia, New Zealand and Hong Kong, for example? These countries have really had the barriers up almost entirely for the last 2 years.
Absolutely. As a New Zealander living in Rome, Italy, I felt firsthand that impact, and certainly glad to see we're seeing those restrictions lift. Australia just this week has opened up once again without quarantine for vaccinated travellers. I'm personally super excited to be getting out there pretty soon to reconnect with my family after what feels like 2 very long years where we haven't been able to get together. We've seen the restrictions ease in Europe. It's great news for the industry, and inevitably we're going to see a boom in both domestic travel and also business travel once again, we're guessing from Easter onwards.
I mean, you're painting quite a rosy picture here, but the reality is that it is still pretty complicated, isn't it? And there are an awful lot of differing things that families have to do. So, for example, if you're travelling with children, it may not be your area of expertise, given that you're a business travel company, but nonetheless, I'm sure you're on top of some of the detail. Many adults are vaccinated, but young children aren't. And are there complications to be aware of there if people are planning Easter and summer holidays?
Absolutely. I've been traveling over the last 6 to 9 months. I have 2 children myself. I've felt firsthand how complicated that can be, both as a business traveler worried about getting home and all of the testing requirements and, the fear of being left overseas and not being able to return after a business trip. But also on the personal side, trying to get my family reunited down in Australasia. I think what's important, Isabel, is to remember to always keep up to date with the information and the constantly changing travel requirements. It has been a bit of a nightmare. Clearly at CWT, this is what we do day in, day out. We're here to support our international travellers, our domestic travellers, and the large government and corporations that we support.
And what is happening?
What I would say,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to check with you what is happening in relation to the dreaded passenger locator forms that the UK government insists on. They seem to be like one of the last remaining restrictions, if you like. It's not so much restriction, but a pile of very boring and time-consuming red tape. Are we going to see the back of those?
There is hope on the horizon, right? So there's talk of Easter timeframe, getting rid of the passenger locator forms. It's been interesting to watch firsthand the requirements, how inconsistent they've been applied, the amount of forms I filled out that have never been required. Even this week, I was traveling between Italy and France. I filled out 2 passenger locator forms. Neither of them were requested on departure. Still, it's a requirement to travel, so it has to be done. In short, I think it's been widely varied how those regulations have been put in place, and it will certainly be one barrier less for travellers to worry about when they finally go away.
And if I can very, very briefly, because we're nearly out of time here, ask you to look into your crystal ball. This time next year, do you think all this will be gone, or are we kind of stuck with a lot of these have you or haven't you had your vaccine questions forever?
My crystal ball says we'll be in a much better place in a year from now. And we're starting to see these travel restrictions easing. It's going to become a lot more one's personal choice and how they feel about traveling. Long may it last. I hope to see those restrictions lifting very soon so we can begin to rebuild here in Europe and start connecting with the rest of the world again.
Thank you very much, and good luck and enjoy being reunited with your long-lost relatives. You've been watching The Briefing with me, Isabel Oakeshott. The show is back every Friday from noon. Up next, it's On the Money with Liam Halligan, but for now, I'll leave you with the weather forecast.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGibbon. A fine Friday for most of us. Blue skies up and down the country for a good few hours. Most places dry and lighter winds compared to recent days and weeks. That will certainly be a noticeable improvement, with high pressure ridging up from the southwest. Weather front staying clear for the time being, and with these isobars a bit more spaced out across the country, it's looking like a decent day. Initially fairly breezy down the North Sea coast, that wind easing, and then light winds for the vast majority. Some cloud building and 1 or 2 showers could develop in the odd place, but for the vast majority it's looking dry, at least until later in the afternoon. Temperatures of 10 Celsius in the south, 8 in the north. Then it clouds over for Scotland and Northern Ireland. A spell of mainly light rain and drizzle crosses Scotland, a few spots there for Northern Ireland as well. And the breeze picks up towards the northwest with gales for the Western Isles and for perhaps parts of the Northern Isles as well by the end of the night. With a breeze in the north and the west, it stays frost-free, but for, say, the southeastern third of the country, temperatures dipping close to freezing, or in some rural spots down to -1 or -2 Celsius. So a touch of frost to begin things for parts of England, parts of East Wales, first thing tomorrow. Plenty of sunshine though, and keep the sunny skies for much of England, Wales, bright skies as well for southern and eastern Scotland. But the further northwest you are, the thicker the cloud will be, and that cloud giving a few spots of rain for mainly the higher parts of western Scotland and Northern Ireland. It'll also be breezy towards the northwest, risk of gales at times for the Western Isles, but that breeze coming up from the south, so relatively mild temperatures in the double figures in most places. Then through Saturday night, a band of rain approaches from the northwest. That will push through during Sunday, weaken, and so for many places, Sunday is another fine day.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for the briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, the briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you the briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here.
Joe Biden walking out.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Don't miss it. The briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews,